What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. It is an absolutely beautiful day out here in the garden, and so hopefully the weather is nice wherever you're at, or at least hopefully it's getting nice enough for you to get out in the garden, because this is just, I'll tell you what, this feels so good. You know, this is the reward for all of the things that have happened over the past couple months. The patience that we have had as gardeners and as humans has been immense. And this is just this payoff, this first nice day in the mid-60s. Oh, it just feels so good. So what are we doing today? Well, we are out in the garden, obviously, because it would be a crime not to be in the garden on a day like this. But we're in the garden, and we're gonna be planting up some of our cilantro. We've got our cilantro here that needs to go in the ground. It's looking absolutely incredible. But I didn't want to just touch on just planting cilantro. I wanted to get this done, and I had a lot of people asking about raised beds. A lot of you that are watching are new to this channel, so welcome. And a lot of you are first-time gardeners that are interested in growing in raised beds. And there were quite a few messages in my inbox around kind of do's and don'ts for raised beds and some common mistakes that I see people making with raised beds. So I want to touch on those. I also want to touch on some misconceptions about raised beds, because there's a lot of questions coming in about, treated and untreated, and cedar versus pine, and concrete versus, just wood, and so many different questions and misconceptions. So I wanted to touch on all of those as well. And yeah, let's get into it, because it's gonna be a fun one. So thank you guys so much for tuning in for today's episode, and just keep staying optimistic. Keep staying optimistic. We're gonna make it. We're gonna make it. This is a good sign. So let's go. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on were some common mistakes that I see people making with raised beds. This is something that, there aren't too many, because you can't really mess up raised beds, but you can do things that kind of make your life a little harder than it needs to be. So with raised beds, you want to pick a height that is going to be deep enough to give you a good amount of soil for your plants to grow in, but not so deep that it causes you more work. Because you have to remember that if a raised bed is, say, 12 inches tall, if you double that, 24 inches tall, that requires twice as much soil. And the soil doesn't just magically fill in the raised beds. You've got to do it. So that's twice as much work. And plants really truthfully don't need a whole lot more than 12 inches. With things like potatoes, you could get by with 10 inches. With things like carrots, you can get by with about 10 inches. Deep-rooted crops like tomatoes, peppers, you can get by with about 12 inches. And so you really don't need all that much soil. Most of your crops are going to be just fine in 12 inches or less. Now, where you don't want to go too shallow is, got to keep working, by the way. So where you can go too shallow is less than 8 inches. If you're only growing things like, lettuce or some of your shallower rooted crops like your herbs and things like that, they don't need a terrible amount of soil. They really are fine in 8 inches or so. But any less than that, and you really start to lose the effectiveness of a raised bed in general. And that makes the cost not really worth it, because this costs something. So you want to make it worth your while. The next mistake I see people making is with what they're filling the raised beds. So when you're filling raised beds, it is very, very, very important, folks, to not cut corners. I see way too many people that are just, they're saying, well, I'll fill raised beds, I'll build the raised beds, but I don't want to spend too much money, so I'm going to cut costs where I can and fill them with topsoil. And there's nothing against topsoil if it's all you have, but in so many instances, for instance, what we filled this raised bed with, which was free compost that we got from a housing development that was mulching up all the trees because they were clear cutting the land. They had all this mulch sitting there breaking down, and we got it for free. We didn't pay anything for this. Yes, it was sweat equity, but we didn't pay anything for this. And in my opinion, this is not even comparable to topsoil. There's no comparison to the quality of soil that there is, just the looseness, the fertility that it will provide, just no comparison. The other thing that I see people cutting corners with raised bed soil is they try to just barely fill it up with enough soil just to kind of get by. Again, so you might have 12 inches of of raised beds, but they'll say, I can't afford to fill it all the way up. I'm just going to fill it up halfway. Well, then you're really defeating the point of a raised bed entirely. I've seen this way too many times. If your raised bed is only half full, your bed is half as effective as it could be. So fill the bed all the way up. Get the most amount of your raised bed out. Otherwise you're not really as growing as effectively as possible. The next mistake I see way too many people making with their raised bed material is they spend too much money. Now, you can spend way too much money by going with things like a potting mix. Folks, potting mix is for containers. You do not need to buy into the hype of putting a potting mix or even a raised bed mix into your raised beds. You're going to be spending a boatload of extra money that you really don't have to spend, and you're not really going to get that much better quality of soil. If you go with a really nice compost, or you make your own raised bed mix with like 1 part peat moss or 1 part coconut coir to 1 part compost, you're going to have that looseness, and you don't need the filler. Like, you don't need any perlite, you don't need any vermiculite, you don't need those additives that they add to those mixes that cost a lot of money, and they really aren't necessary because you're growing in a massive raised bed. And so you're not going to have the issues like drying out and water holding capabilities and aeration like you would in a container. In a container, the growing conditions are so much different. So don't spend more than you have to. So those are really all the big mistakes that I see people making with raised beds. Now I want to touch on some misconceptions. There are a lot of questions that come up about the building materials and kind of what building material is best. And for that, I would say it's not really a cut and dry answer. The best building material for you is not going to necessarily be the best building material for me. In our case, we were able to cut cost by using a untreated lumber. That's because it was inexpensive, it was readily available, and it just worked best in our scenario. If you're someplace that gets a lot of rainfall, gets a lot of precipitation, and your beds are going to rot, like the Pacific Northwest, untreated pine is going to be probably one of the worst options for you. But also cedar, redwoods are very readily available, and the lumber is far more inexpensive over there than it is here. All of that is shipped over here from the Pacific Northwest. So we actually pay a premium for that type of stuff. And yes, it does have a longer life expectancy, but marginally more than using an untreated pine. With a cedar, you're going to get about 20-25 years here in Michigan out of cedar. But if you're using a untreated pine, you're going to get about 5 to 7 years. So the cost compared to the life expectancy of the wood just does not make a whole lot of financial sense for me, and that's why I went with untreated pine. But again, there are a lot of other options. I get asked all the time about cinder blocks. Are cinder blocks a good option? Here in Michigan, cinder blocks are a terrible option. And the reason why is because during freezing and thawing, cinder blocks are very porous. They hold on to moisture, and that moisture then gets caught into the porous structure of the cinder blocks. And what happens is it freezes. When water expands, or when water freezes, it expands. And you'll end up with broken cinder blocks in literally a matter of 1 or 2 years. And so cinder blocks are not a good option for here in Michigan. But compare that to an option to someone living in a very arid environment like Arizona. Just tossing it out there. First thing that came to my head. Arizona, cinder blocks would be a much better option because of the fact that the porous structure of the cinder blocks actually will be better because it holds all the air in the cinder blocks. See, wood does not have a whole lot of air gaps because it's pretty dense. Compare that to a cinder block, which is very porous. Those air gaps actually act as an insulator. And so in hot weather, you're going to be protected because of those air gaps in the wood. It's actually going to keep the soil cooler if you use cinder blocks than if you were to use wood. So again, based on your location, it's going to suit you, something is going to suit you better than another thing. So I can't necessarily say what is a better building material. And then finally, I want to touch on the biggest question that seems to come up, and that is, what building materials should I not use, or what building materials should I be careful of using when I'm trying to build my raised beds? The first thing I would stay away from are tires. Now, tires are really cool. They look really cool as raised beds. But when you're putting edibles inside of them, you know, like if I were to use a tire raised bed, I would use them for like flowers and things like that, non-edibles. If you're using edibles and you're using them in tires, tires have been known for years to leach heavy metals and harmful chemicals because they are, it's a plastic, and the plastic is also lined with a lot of chemicals that you just do not want leaching into your soil. And that's what happens when the tires heat up. When the tires heat up in the dark, you know, because they're dark in the hot sun, they can leach some of those chemicals into the soil, and that's the last thing that I want in my food. The next thing that you really want to stay away from are railroad ties. Railroad ties are they're treated with a chemical called creosote, and creosote is basically a really bad chemical that you just do not want in your soil. Again, another thing that's going to leach into your soil. The next thing that a lot of people ask about is treated lumber. Do I recommend treated lumber? Is this something that I should stay away from? Is this kind of in this category of things I would not build a raised bed out of? Old treated lumber, if you were to get treated lumber from, say, 50s to the 70s, like vintage treated lumber, if that's a thing, you know, just old treated lumber pre-1970s, you really don't want to go with that type of wood because those types of woods were actually treated with a material called copper arsenate, I believe is what it's called. And so again, that is a very dangerous chemical that you don't want in your soil. You don't want it leaching into your soil around your plants. But if you use modern day treated lumber, it's actually pressure treated. And pressure treated lumber is treated with safe chemicals. I believe it's still treated with copper, but copper is a beneficial it's a beneficial mineral in your soil. It's not going to be harmful if it leaches into your soil, even in small amounts. And so with modern day treated lumber, you're fine. So it really depends on the age of the lumber that you're using. But you know, for the most part, I would say I feel completely safe using treated lumber. It does go back to the cost though. You know, if you're using treated lumber, the cost of the treated lumber can be pretty expensive. And so in my case, it really wasn't worth it for me to go with treated lumber. But that's raised beds. Now I know there's a lot of other questions and things that people wonder about with raised beds, but those are the big points. You know, raised beds offer a huge benefit to you as a gardener when it comes to keeping the quality of the soil at a premium. It also really helps to maximize your planting abilities because you're keeping the soil loose, you're keeping the soil fertile, you're picking the best soil possible, so you're able to grow more plants in less space. And so if raised beds are something that you are considering and something that you really would like to implement in your garden, I would recommend checking out our other videos. We have a ton of videos on how to build raised beds, how we built our raised beds, even how we filled our raised beds. And I would recommend watching those videos if you're interested, because I think it's a worthwhile thing to add to your garden. And I certainly have seen so many amazing benefits from raised beds that I just don't see in a traditional garden, in a traditional in-ground garden. The amount of work that goes into it, just the upkeep to keep the soil quality at a premium, it's just so much more work. It's so much it's so much more labor intensive, and the initial blood, sweat, and tears that goes into building these raised beds will be seen for years and years to come. So I would recommend it. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you have any more questions, post them in the comments box below and I will do my best to answer them. And yeah, go enjoy the day, go build some raised beds, and share pictures with us over on Instagram or on Facebook. If you do decide to build some raised beds, make sure to share those pictures with us. We love seeing what you guys are doing in your garden. All right, I gotta get this finished. I gotta get this cilantro all planted up, and we'll catch you all on the next episode. Remember to grow big or go home, everyone. See ya. Bye.